Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our book club event. We're going to give people a few minutes to trickle in here, and then we will get started. So be patient there in the waiting room. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. We're just admitting people to the meeting, and then we'll get started. There is a live stream of this event on the Facebook page, the Torrey House Press Facebook page. If you want to share with friends, it'll also be recorded and available later. All right, well, the participant list is filling up, so thank you all so much for coming. Hello, Louise. I see some of you active in the chat, which is great. That's where we'll be taking questions. All right, well, let's get started. 6:02. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. My name is Greta Anderson. I'm the Deputy Director of Western Watersheds Project. I am in Jukshawn, which is Tucson, Arizona, the lands of the Tohono O'odham people. My pronouns are she and her, should you need to refer to me. And I am leading up this book club for Western Watersheds Project. I will be asking our esteemed guests some questions, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation we're going to have tonight. I'm going to turn it over to Kirsten Allen, who is the Executive Director and Publisher at Torrey House Press, and she's going to make the introductions for everybody. Thanks.
Greetings and welcome, everyone. Thank you, Greta Anderson. Thank you, Western Watersheds Project. It's a joy to be working on this book club together. I'm Kirsten Johanna Allen, Publisher and Executive Director of Torrey House Press. Torrey House Press is the West's only nonprofit literary press. We publish voices for the land. And I'm coming to you today from Torrey, Utah, the traditional homelands of Ute, Southern Ute, Paiute, and Navajo people. It is my honor to introduce to you three wonderful writers and human beings whom I've had the great joy to work with to produce the fabulous book, Behind the Bear's Ears, Exploring the Natural and Cultural Histories of a Sacred Landscape by R.E. Burrillo. Ralph R.E. Burrillo is joining us from his home in Scottsdale, Arizona. Also joining us are Regina Lopez-Whiteskunk, who wrote the foreword to Behind the Bear's Ears. She joins us from Toyac, Colorado on Ute Mountain Ute lands, and Lyle Bolinkwa, who wrote the afterword to the book and who joins us from the Third Mesa on Hopi. It's a pleasure to be talking with each of you wherever you are. And we all hope you'll take a moment to reflect on whose land you are joining us from tonight as we discuss this really terrific book about Bear's Ears, about the archaeology, about how Bear's Ears kind of created modern archaeology, how Bear's Ears has been affected by archaeology over the years, and what is the past, future, and present of Bear's Ears, and how are they the same and how are they all different? I'm now going to turn things back over to Greta Anderson of Western Watersheds, and she's going to lead our discussion. Everyone, please join us with questions in the chat here on the Zoom or on the Facebook Live page, and we will be incorporating your questions into the discussion as well. Also, we invite you to buy a copy of the book if you haven't done so already. You can go to torreyhousepress.org. And in the Zoom chat, you can see the link to purchase the book here. If you use the code Western Watersheds, 20% of book purchases, not just of this book, but all book purchases will go back to Western Watersheds Project. So again, that's torreyhouse.org. Go to our store, use Western Watersheds, and we're all in partnership together on telling these great stories. Greta, take it away.
Thanks. Well, I'm actually going to let Ralph take it away with a reading to sort of set the tone, get us into the place of Bears Ears, and bring us all to this important space.
Thank you, Greta. Thank you, Kirsten. I had a little bit of trouble trying to decide what from the book I was going to read to try to anchor us there in the landscape, considering the grandiosity of that term "us." I decided on something it's personal and subjective, because I think that it's important to approach a place like Bears Ears, as humanistically and as non-objectively as possible. And so my first encounter with what would become Bears Ears National Monument, what I now call Once and Future Bears Ears National Monument, was in 2006. I was not yet an archaeologist. I was merely an aficionado of the old and interesting. I spent a week in November backpacking through the upper third of Grand Gulch, a great defile that cuts through the impressive landmass of Cedar Mesa beneath the gaze of the Bears Ears formations. Much of my time was spent marveling over how scarcely visited such a wondrous and heavenly place could be. In the 4 days I spent down in the Gulch and 3 additional days spent atop Cedar Mesa, I saw exactly 3 other people, including a fellow backpacker to whom I gave a ride between trailheads so he could complete a loop. We hardly said a word to each other. That was then. Things have changed quite a bit. By the time I got involved in research and conservation efforts at the Bears Ears area, I was paying off a rather sizable karmic debt that I felt I owed the place, and it certainly isn't scarcely visited anymore. Early archaeologists like Alfred A.V. Kidder, that tendency, by the way, of going by the first 2 initials in publication is a venerated one amongst archaeologists, regarded the entire San Juan region as a single, quote, culture area. The archaeologically recognized Bears Ears culture area, or simply the Bears Ears area, is the westernmost portion of the northern hemisphere of the San Juan world, sometimes known as the Greater Mesa Verde world. And that's important, as archaeology has progressed upward from consideration solely of artifacts, so Indiana Jones, to consideration of culture areas, and finally to consideration of entire landscapes and regions. Archaeologists have come to appreciate that no accurate portrayal of human sociocultural anything can be fully understood at less than a regional scale. To understand the history and cultures of the Bears Ears area, especially during the ancient and slightly more recent pre-contact periods, it has to be seen in the context of the region as a whole. This is a running theme in the developing world of American archaeology. A major sub-theme in this book is the role that Bears Ears has played and continues to play in the story of that development. The other 2 major sub-themes are the cultural history of the place itself and the story of my own unlikely involvement there, which interdigitate and converge in a number of interesting ways. It makes for long chapters, as these 3 sub-themes and the narrative arcs they describe are explored in a gradually tightening weave, but there's a reason. My hope is that in telling the human story of the place in such a way, a personal way, will lead the reader into a deeper understanding of why it is so important to so many people. And thus my introduction to Bears Ears.
Thank you. That was perfect. And I think there really was a lot of your personal narrative in the story that in the book that really helps weave your own path through, which I really appreciated. I also, so my first question for everybody, I realized after I wrote it was sort of ignorant, but I said I think there's a tendency to consider Bears Ears as an important piece of human history, but we're really on a continuum of relationship with the land. And my ignorance being that not all of us feel that way, that it's historical in nature. It's a living place for a lot of people. And so my question being, how do you think archaeologists of the future will define the significance of the area now? When they look back to the time of now, what will the greater context how will people see it, is its importance in the future. And Ralph, do you want to go first, or Regina or Lyle? Any of you?
Well, yeah, I can lead that off, having spoken just a little bit about, or touched on that subject a bit, and just setting it up here in the book, and then I'd be happy to pass it along to, I know Lyle has been even way more recently than I have, within a matter of days, conducting some of that research up there, or doing some of that important work up there. So yeah, let me just say by way of answer, I think when people characterize Bears Ears solely, or the Bears Ears area solely, as an important piece or an important component of human history, it presents a somewhat stilted view of history. Actually, if you don't mind, I'm going to do something a little unorthodox here and read something that was cut from the final version of the book, but will hopefully be out soon at any rate. And that is, the job of authoring history is a lot like curating art or arranging flowers. Your subject matter is essentially limitless, and your audience attention span, not to mention your budget, is very much not. So telling the whole story, capital letters, including all of the variables that went into making everything happen the way that it did, and the consequential things that happened because of them, would take you from the dawn of time to its eventual collapse. And since ecology teaches us that everything is connected all over the world and beyond, and thus any truly honest portrayal of history would consist of someone simply waving their hand and saying it's all that. So with that in mind, I think, it's the role of the historian to sift through the great messy Gordian knot of the world's unfolding, and decide, based on whatever their criteria are, which stories they think are worth telling. I hope future historians, for example, are telling some of the stories from 2020, from early January 2021, and so on, because there are important lessons to be learned from them. And I hope future historians, and by the way, archaeologist really just means material historian, will also focus on the present story as it's unfolding of the Bears Ears area as a learning experience. This is the first ever national monument proposed by a tribal coalition, by an indigenous coalition. And when people like the Trump administration, Orrin Hatch, the Southern Institute, and so on, attempted to chop up the monument and to thereby destroy what it symbolized, the response from coast to coast largely has been outrage. And I think that's the story I'd still like to see historians telling about this particular period in Bears Ears history in the future.
Thanks. Lyle or Regina, would you like to respond?
I guess I can go next. Good evening, everybody. My name is Lyle Bolinkwa. I am a member of the Hopi tribe. I come from the village of Balenquah on Third Mesa. If you're not familiar with Hopi lands, it's located in northeastern Arizona, about an hour and a half or so outside of Flagstaff, northeast of Flagstaff, Arizona. And so that's where I call home these days. And my background is partially in archaeology. I've been working as an archaeologist for 20 plus years throughout, the Four Corners region, really looking at the ancestral history of my ancestors, across the Southwest. And like Ralph, my introduction to the Bears Ears region occurs around 2007, when I started working as a river guide on the San Juan River. And so it was during, those years that I was introduced to the landscape and got to know it a little bit more, and, have become more involved in the conservation work that, is ongoing right now. I think that question is really, one, is something I can relate to. Like Ralph mentioned, I just came back. I just finished 2 sessions of stabilization work at a site called River House, located along the San Juan River there, just outside of Bluff. It's the first major sites you encounter on a river trip. And a lot of us, I'm not from that area, of course, but even back then in 2007, when I first started visiting that site, it was rare to see people driving into the site and having such readily available access to it. That all has changed now. It was really astonishing to see the number of visitors. I think the BLM estimates that over 20,000 visitors come to that site annually now. Most of them not by the river anymore. So there was a lot of vehicular OHV traffic, a few hardy souls who were hiking in and backpacking in, and then of course some river trips. Part of the work we were doing was stabilization of the site itself. And so that entails looking at all the previous history of the stabilization work that has done. So we have the benefit and kind of the comfort of being able to look back and maybe, kind of judge what other stabilization work has been done in the past, saying this was wrong, this was right, they missed this, or they maybe overdid it in this part of the site itself. And so, when I think about what other archaeologists, and really I'm hoping that encompasses a lot more indigenous archaeologists, into the future. That's something I hope, that perspective of, as folks look back, encompasses those indigenous perspectives. I hope they see that, during this time frame, during this time that we're in right now, we're doing our best. I think that's the thing about being in archaeology, is that we're continually learning, about the sites, the landscapes that we are working in. And so that knowledge doesn't have an endpoint, so to speak. It's continually evolving as our research, as our interaction, expands within these places. And so being, an archaeologist working on sites like this, I can only hope that the work we do now is understandable, that we document it as best as we can, that we share as much of it as we can with the folks that are coming to these places, because that's really, the only true way that we can develop a better understanding of this landscape, of the thousands of years, the thousands of generations of people that have lived, in these areas. And here we are in one little, slice of time, trying to place our impact on these places, or trying to generate our understanding of what's there. So for those future archaeologists, that are going to be watching this somewhere into the, future, I hope that you're both kind to us, in the sense that, yes, we're doing our best. We're trying to incorporate and be as inclusive as possible with the perspectives that we are working with, and that's something I hope that is really looked upon as a changing movement within, not just archaeology itself, but within, just our interactions amongst one another, is that we are broadening our understanding of one another. And that involves that two-way dialogue. And so, even though I'm restricted kind of in a way to archaeological paradigms and things of that nature, I can only hope that the work we do now, really has influence and impact to future generations, and that they're still able to build off of, what we're doing right now, and, in the time that we're given at these places. So yeah, it's something I think about a lot in terms of the future. We're always, contemplating the past, of course, at these sites, but we also need to remember, again, like Ralph mentioned, we're on this continuum of learning, and it's never just going to end with us. And so we need to keep that in mind, and always be hopeful that the work we do now, has impacts, down the line.
Thank you, Lyle and Ralph. My name is Regina Lopez-Whiteskunk. I am of the Uinta and Weymouth Band. I'm an enrolled member of the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe, currently residing in Toyac, Colorado, which is at the foothills of the Ute Mountain and directly adjacent to the Mesa Verde. And one of the things over the past several years, I had the honor to participate on as a elected official for the Ute Mountain Ute tribe, and also served in the capacity as one of the original co-chairs of the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition. And you know, when you think back to the job and the capacity that the world of archaeology holds, we always got to remember that this is definitely a group of individuals who are basically collecting information and, in theory, creating a story and trying to tell that story to the best of their capacity as they have collected and are learning from the area that they may be located at. And one of the things that I pray and I hope for the future archaeologists is that they learn from all the lessons that we've all experienced from the past into today, and hopefully they collectively take all of that to come up with a very filled story from all the good and the bad. Because if we didn't have all these difficult areas that we've had to grow from, then we wouldn't be experiencing that evolution in this field to continue on to tell these stories. I pray that the archaeologists of tomorrow will look back on some of the hardships and some of the disagreements that we've had along the way, and that they'll look back at this time and see that there was a change and a shift that occurred within this time period, within the administration, being that it did create rifts in this area and with the tribal governments, and how and where did we go from there? What did we do? Did we fall apart or did we fall together? And that's what I'm hoping, that through all of this, that the archaeologists of tomorrow, that they tell a story that is truthful and impactful to lead them into the future, but not create the story that best fills their agendas. And that's some of the lessons to be learned of the past. A lot of archaeologists came out and collected and tried to gain a knowledge of the area, but they also began to create stories that they fit into their views or their assumptions. So a lot of times, a lot of what gets recorded into history is always not the correct version of that. And I'm hoping that those are some of the lessons that the archaeologists of tomorrow will recognize, gain experience from, and move forward and help to create a better field in which they can collect these stories and study the life and times that we're living in today, and move forward into a greater tomorrow to tell a impactful time period, this slice of time that we've had the honor to experience. I mean, where is it in history that 5 tribes come together to heal their relationships, to work together to achieve a common knowledge by reaching to the federal level to ask for a designation of protection of these sacred sites? That hasn't been done, but we want them to be able to take from that and see how that served and how that impacted this current time, and see all of the different controversies and the different conversations and the whole world that cracked open before us. And now we have so many different opportunities. What do we do with that? What choices can we make? We can make great choices. We can continue to inspire each other, but how do we continue to tell these stories? What are those mechanisms? What are those medias? We need to just fall together rather than fall apart in all the catastrophes that history has always shown us. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, very powerful perspectives. I appreciate it. I especially appreciate the sort of wedging the facts to fit your narrative part, and that sort of leads into my next question, or which is Western Watersheds Project. We're primarily known for dealing with our that we try to prevent adverse impacts of livestock grazing on public lands. And primarily that's ecological impacts. And so we're looking at impacts to wildlife habitat or water quality, things like that. But we also, all the time, of course, on public lands, there's this cultural resource issue, and they very often check a box, which Ralph talks about very succinctly in his book here, and don't really give the attention that the resources or the story, the real story that these lands hold. And so I wanted to share one recent anecdote, and then I have a question. But on a recent Freedom of Information Act request about the Sonoran Desert National Monument, there was a response from the Bureau of Land Management, Arizona's state archaeologist, who basically cautioned people against using the word adverse. He said he would suggest not using the term adverse because adverse effects can be mitigated by strategic placement, et cetera. But his concluding paragraph is, in sum, I've never thought that livestock grazing results in adverse effects in the 106 process, the historic preservation process, if the allotments are properly managed. I've always made findings of no historic properties affected for livestock grazing activities. In other words, he never met a grazing project he didn't like, on no matter what the impacts might have been to the cultural resource. So that tells you something about how we see the traditional values of these lands being overlooked and replaced by this other land use, grazing, which is really very much the story of the West in general. And so I was going to ask you to speak a little bit to the impacts of livestock grazing that you've seen in your work, Ralph, and what you think the ongoing influence of livestock grazing, and not just maybe also the ranchers opposing the designation, but the structural physical impacts of grazing on the resources that you're all trying so hard to protect.
I guess we'll just keep going in order here, or the order that we've established. First, yeah, wow, that's grounds for a lawsuit. I don't know how familiar you are with the 2009 SUA case, where they essentially collectively came to the conclusion that the BLM had been boilerplating impacts from travel, from especially off-highway travel, and not really considering those impacts in their EISs. And they paid my rent quite a few times with their subsequent need to create travel management plans as a result of that lawsuit. So yeah, keeping your eyes on that sort of thing, the ways that people that wrangle around legislation like NHPA, NEPA, NAGPRA, ARPA, et cetera. You know, we need watchdogs. We really do. Yeah, so she mentioned something from the book. I think I'm just going to go ahead and read it because we were talking about it beforehand, and then afterwards I'll just give one or two little points of my own. But since it's covered in here pretty well, there was a case there in Bears Ears, speaking specifically about these resource protection laws like Section 106 of the NHPA. These laws were brought to bear against the BLM in a history-making case in the Bears Ears area. Cows have grazed allotments there since grazing allotments were invented, and about a century's worth of trampling, manure, invasive plant species, and once standing prehistoric architecture knocked over by itchy bovine rumps testifies to this in almost every corner of the place. In 1990, a consortium of conservationists and wilderness advocates decided they'd had enough. The BLM was legally challenged over failure to adequately account for the impacts of grazing in their blanket resource management plan for the Comb Wash allotment, where cows were busily wreaking havoc in Lower Arch, Mule, Fish Creek, Owl Creek, and Road canyons. According to NEPA, it's the National Environmental Policy Act, an environmental impact statement is required for potentially environment impacting practices like the doling out of grazing leases on federal lands. And the BLM insisted that the overarching impact study comprising the resource management plan was just fine. The same as they would say about the issue of fracking near Chaco a little over a decade later. The challengers disagreed, with some arguing that most of the RMP was copy-paste boilerplate that didn't consider specific impacts to specific localities. You'd be surprised how often this happens. That boilerplating, again, that's how the BLM got in trouble with SUA, not just once, but once in a major way. One BLM employee even made the mistake of owning up to this, explaining that he only took amount and condition of foraging into account when he set livestock numbers in the canyons. Things like water quality, habitat, wildlife habitat, soil erosion, scenery, recreation, cultural resources, etc., weren't considered at all. He later tried to retract his testimony. Plaintiffs, comprised largely of a number of conservation organizations, insisted that a separate EIS be done for specific impacts from grazing. They offered up the Grand Gulch primitive area, so that place that I first got introduced to the Bears Ears area in 2006, as an example of the ecological benefits incurred when grazing is disallowed. And I would add to their testimony that I personally selfishly prefer not to have to drink manure flavored water while I'm backpacking in Grand Gulch. The defendants, comprised largely of agribusiness lobbyists and affiliated fluffers, countered primarily on the basis of precedent. It's a slippery slope, they contended. If a bunch of damn environmentalists succeed in removing cows from 5 canyons that have little forage and lots of archaeology, they might go from there to kicking cows out of all the other beautiful and fragile places. Wouldn't that be a shame? Anyway, the case dragged on for about 3 years, and in the end, it was a big win for the plaintiffs. This was the first time a federal judge in the United States ever considered the environmental impact of grazing and the extent to which having cows on public lands is in the best interest of that public. Imaginative strain was not required on the part of the judge. The case was simply a matter of compelling the agency to interpret the law in a less shady manner. In other words, compelling the agency to do its job. On a personal note, well, not so much personal, but in my experience, my professional experience working first in Glen Canyon National Recreation Area, where I was an archaeological technician. This was actually when I met Lyle in the late 2000s when I was tending bar at Mogollon. Glen Canyon, it's got an interesting management setup where the National Park Service manages everything about Glen Canyon except grazing. It's BLM that manages grazing. And so you get this interesting case study where these two land management agencies are operating in the same space, and you can do a compare and contrast. And it works out beautifully in that it's basically terrible. And, you can watch, this agency will come up, members or personnel from this agency will come up with, ideas about impacts that are happening, and they'll blame it on grazing, and they'll say, we recommend this, we recommend that. In most Park Service units, that would be that. It would become policy. And there the BLM says, well, according to our policy, and just shoots it down. And it was astonishing to see that in real time. Not far from there in Capitol Reef, one of the first academic, in fact, maybe the only major academic study I've ever seen on the impact of cattle grazing, specifically on cultural resources, was an experiment that was set up where artificial archaeological sites were created, where they point plotted, using sub-meter accuracy, point plotted ceramic artifacts, lithic artifacts, etc. Let cows graze on it for, I think, a full season, and they went back and looked. Half of them had disappeared, all of them had moved, a few of them had been stomped on and shattered. And they published the results. It's now one of the most widely cited studies on the impacts of grazing. And yet, despite all that, boy, it's a Sisyphean battle. It's unbelievable. I've been reading a few other books. I would recommend This Land by Christopher Ketchum, Leave It As It Is, by David Gessner. There's a few others that have taken this on. Edward Abbey back in the 80s, Bernard Devoto before him have been saying all along, this is not worth the costs. And we've been saying it for decades. We'll probably be saying it for a century. And I should probably stop there.
Regina or Lyle, would you like to respond to that? What do you think about it?
It's an interesting topic. I as a former tribal leader of my tribe there, we've often wrestled with just the fact of livestock ownership. And anytime that you are responsible for another life or of another animal or being, your children, you want to make the best possible decisions. And in society today, as we all know, Native Americans, we had our own systems in place prior to the encounters with the newcomers, the Europeans, the Spaniards, down to the settlers, and those that came out to homestead these places. It was through that learning period that our people began to see the introduction of these animals and how they came out. And it's interesting because my first year on council, I served as the treasurer. And one of the areas that was really troublesome was the livestock owners' activities. But it's interesting because I'm still battling with this, even personally, because my people have gained a sense of entitlement. They've gained a sense of ownership of certain things. And so through all of this, we've learned that if we have these animals, we're charged with taking care of them, then now we have entitlement to certain land areas, because currently, and I don't know if they're actually still active, but certain areas within the Bears Ears region, the Ute Mountain Ute tribe had what was termed as traditional grazing areas. And, it really kind of was really difficult for me to try to reconcile, this whole action of being taught that if you're in charge of caring for this animal, you've got to make the best decisions for it. Now you got to figure out where you're going to graze it at. Okay, now they're telling us we're entitled to these areas. These areas are located in certain regions in southeastern Utah into Colorado here. Okay, but what we were never taught and we weren't aware of were the impacts that these were having on our sacred spaces. And so even today, leaders, it just depends on how you were raised and in what families you were raised. And when I say that, there's families that may have raised families that are related to healers, medicine people, spiritual leaders. And so families that are in that type of situation have a whole different and maybe a little more of a relationship with land, environment, the herbs, the resources of the land, versus a family who now goes about telling the world that they are cattle owners, they're livestock people, they're ranchers. And so they're the ones who have that sense of entitlement. They're the ones who believe that because they got to make some good decisions based on this relationship with this animal, without thinking that it's actually impacting the two worlds that we have to maneuver our activity in. And it's a big challenge. It was a big challenge for me as I was doing the work on the campaign to seek designation of this area, because now coming from that angle, you're looking at the impacts, you're looking at the different policies that are in place. You're looking at, you know, a whole governmental structure that basically was set on a trajectory to basically commit genocide. And to commit genocide is to erase a people from and disconnect them from their homelands, from things that are essential in their lives, and that includes land, water, their heritage, their language, and that was what it was. So there's two worlds colliding a lot of times within tribal groups. There's the person and the individual that is taught to work the land and to become a good rancher, to do all of this stuff. You have a sense of entitlement, you got ownership, and now you're making decisions based on these animals without realizing that the worlds are actually colliding. And so it's a very tough situation. But as you begin to learn about NEPA, as you begin to learn about the policies within the EPA that are being violated, it isn't until you walk that path that you actually begin to see those worlds collide. Now, where does that leave you? And then that's, for me, you know, Bears Ears was very big in the area that it prompted me to reach to my father, to my grandparents, back to the land, to really figure out who I was. Who was I before I came into this position, and who am I going to be today? When I was a decision maker, these were a lot of the things that were the internal devices that needed to be reconciled so that I could be the best voice, so I could be the best leader that I could possibly be, and hopefully basing it upon the relationship with my elders and a lot of my knowledge of the land and a lot of my experiences with what I had grown up with. That's the only way that I could maneuver through a lot of this. But you know, when you think about it today, currently, the chairman for my tribe right now, Chairman Manuel Hart, he is one of the biggest cattle owners. Him and I used to have the biggest disagreements on council when I served. I served along the side of him. He always would pound in his hard stance position of, but I am a steward of the land and my cattle do provide something to this environment. I said, yeah, a lot of destruction. So our worlds did collide.
Lyle, would you like to respond to that? Contribute?
Yeah, just briefly, you know, as a federal archaeologist, as a state archaeologist, a tribal archaeologist, I don't think there hasn't been a piece of land that I've worked on that hasn't exhibited, you know, some sort of impact, negative impact from cattle. I need to state though that I do come from a cattle family. Many Hopis do run livestock on our lands. However, there is a lesson there, you know, in terms of how, you know, what Regina was talking about in terms of, you know, our responsibility as livestock owners and taking that seriously. And so, you know, I've seen the impacts of overgrazing, what can happen here on Hopi lands in terms of, you know, destruction of watersheds, the introduction of invasive plants, down cutting, soil erosion. All of those things have happened and are ongoing right now. I see those impacts occurring in the Cedar Mesa Bears Ears region right now. I've also been a part of projects that have been, we've been restoring ecosystems by removing livestock, putting up fences, you know, removing feral horses and those kinds of things that allow the land to rejuvenate. And I think that's an option that many people may take as a personal offense to that entitlement, you know, that like Regina stated, you know, there are livestock owners that do have that sense that, you know, by being out on the land, they are, you know, serving, providing something positive. that can get, out of hand really easily. And so we need to have a wide kind of understanding, of what these impacts are. And for Ralph to mention that there have been very little studies, in-depth studies about the impacts of cattle across wide landscapes, is also an indication that, those types of efforts need to be undertaken as well. So I do think that there are negative impacts occurring because of the livestock. We need to start thinking about, oftentimes we're told that this is the only thing the land is good for, is grazing, that there are not other options for us or for the land to provide something back to us. And so, and that can take on a lot of different, forms and come in different ways. And so it is a really difficult issue in terms of, historical livelihoods for people, but also, again, it goes back to that responsibility of, recognizing what your livelihood may be doing to not only the current situation, but, the future, landscapes that, people are going to inherit, and what is the costs and overall effort going to be needed to restore those landscapes back to something that is sustainable. And so, there's a lot of issues involved in that, and I think that that's one major issue that is ongoing within the Bears Ears issue.
Definitely a complex question, isn't it? Yeah, I'm going to jump in just a bit to offer some comments and questions from some of our participants off screen. Lewis Williams says, ancient waves, we do our best to represent the ancestors, Bighorn, Mother Earth, and future generations. While providing educational tours in Bears Ears, we are determined to help our ancestors' stories be heard. And Lorna Reed points out that a backpacking trip into Grand Gulch changed her life in the 90s. And she says she feels like it's one of the things she wants to do is protect the soils, protect the beauty, that's a real priority. Olivia Juarez says, Regina, what you are saying, and she's talking about when you were doing your work on Bears Ears, makes me think about how standing up for Bears Ears National Monument is about being the ancestors we want to be. And I think that's, I know that's something that when we think in terms of time going behind us and before us, that if it's not linear, we can be more in touch with that idea. One more question, a question here, I'll jump in. Mike Walters asks, we've seen the destruction of many petroglyph sites from Zion to Moab to Cottonwood Canyon Road. How do we clue the mass public into preserving these sites, but still enjoying them? So kind of moving a little bit off of the livestock grazing question into more of the human interaction question. Ralph, do you have how do you feel that we can help the public preserve while still enjoy?
First of all, totally off the topic, but I'm glad to hear from Lewis. Lyle and I were just talking about him beforehand. Lyle's sporting his Ancient Waves t-shirt. I've got the sticker that I've been waving. Yeah. Whole other story, but we really need more Indigenous wilderness guides. And I think what Lewis is doing is tremendous. I know he and Lyle have been working together a long time. I'm glad he's here.
Can you tell us a little bit more about Ancient Waves, just for a second?
Well, Lyle might know more than I do. My experience with Lewis himself is very limited. We worked briefly, ever so briefly, on a guiding tour where I was retained by Friends of Cedar Mesa to go and give guided interpretive guiding trip, through, they wanted to have an archaeologist there to talk about material history and this and that. And the classic story that I think I've told 4 or 5 times now in public forums like this is, coincidentally, speaking about petroglyphs, we were visiting this site down there on Sand Island, and it showed there's a whole bunch of bighorn sheep, and one of them is half bighorn and half human. And they turned to me and they said, "Archaeologist, what does that mean?" And I said, I presented all this stuff about, well, as archaeologists, data and objective and this and that, and used the old analogy of would you know what Smokey the Bear was if you were from a different culture? And they'd all, oh yeah, And then I turned to Lewis, who was there, and Lewis is Diné. He lives there in Bluff. And I said, "What's your take on that?" And he went through this phenomenal little pantomime where he's, as indigenous hunters, the way that we hunt is you get right into the mind, into the spirit of the animal. He started kind of acting like a bighorn sheep and pantomiming it. And you really get into, in other words, get into the animal in order to have like a successful hunt. And he points back up at this panel of all these bighorn sheep and one that's like half human, half bighorn. And he says, "What I see there is a hunter who's gotten so much into that animal that they're going to have a successful hunt." And every single one of us turned and looked back and went, "Son of a bitch, that is exactly what that looks like, isn't it?" And none of us would have ever thought of that. No one, as a scientist, like I never would have come to that conclusion. The only way you know that stuff is to know it. And so that was my experience, working with Lewis. And so lo and behold, just about 2.5 years later, he was able to secure a business license. He was able to secure permitting. I'm not sure what, parts of the landscape he's permitted to guide on, but he's, as far as I know, he's the permitted backcountry wilderness guide, indigenous backcountry wilderness guide in the Bears Ears area now as of fairly recently. And we're all really happy to hear it. Lyle, if you want to add anything to that, I think you probably know even more than I do, and then we can get back onto the rock art. In fact, I think maybe Regina can speak to that rock art issue probably more than I can.
Yeah, how do we preserve while still, how can we teach people to preserve while still enjoying?
Just to help tee up the answer, I think that ancient waves is, having more indigenous wilderness guides, having more of that, the type of folks out there on the landscape leading people who are, decked out in Patagonia gear and so on, and showing them how to interact with things respectfully and what it means to them on a personal level and as well as a cultural level, I think is huge, because it's that representation largely just it hasn't been out there. The outdoor recreation, and this is especially true of the OHVers in areas like Moab, where all those impacts to petroglyph sites have been happening so much. That's primarily, Middle American white folks. So that representation really just isn't there. And so, yeah, somewhat coincidentally, what we're talking about right now, folks like Lewis, Lyle and his river guiding, I think getting more indigenous voices out there and being part of that wilderness community is a big step in the right.
Regina, in your work on the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition, you also worked with a lot of different kinds of recreation groups. How did this question come up in some of the discussions that you were having back on the coalition? How to teach people how to preserve and enjoy?
Well, and that's an interesting term, to preserve. About 2 weeks ago, I was working with a young man who came out to do an interview with me, and we were walking through a couple of sites, and he asked a real interesting question that just totally stopped me in my tracks. And it really made me think. But he asked me, and I think what he assumed was I would have a real quick answer to come back to the question. And the question was, what does preserving look like to you? And do you want to know the first thing that came to my mind was my grandma creating preserves from berries and fruits. That's the first thing that came to my mind when he asked me that. What does preserving look like to me? And you know, it was interesting because my answer would have been entirely different from my daughter's answer, which then brought me to this point of everybody is going to have a different answer when it comes to this question. It is going to look different. It's going to feel different. And I think that was part of the beauty to the conversations that we were having at many different levels, because we were engaging with conversations at very high levels within the federal Department of Interior. We were also having those same discussions with the administration, with the current with the past administration of President Obama. You know, and each time I think about that, what does that look like, and how was that engaged? And what it came down to was, how are we using the land, and who are you asking? Who's using the land? There's many different users to that land, and you know, through that we've come to a point of, does it make it right for me to say I'm going to use this land with my off-road vehicles? And is that any less or any more important than what the tribes are asking? So you take and you start to equate different conversations. We engaged with all different outdoor users, and it was interesting because the last group to come online with us was the rock climbers, and they picked the location to have the conversation. It had to be in Moab. How ironic is that? Pretty much right in the center of one of the best places to go rock climbing. And you know, it was interesting because, like I said, you know, you ask this question, but every one of us are going to have a different answer. But is everybody's answer any less or any more important? If we begin to really want to get down to it, what we're going to have to do is a mean process of negotiating what is important and creating how that looks. You know, I don't believe that there's any right answer or wrong answer, because I believe that, you know, acknowledgement from each of the groups is definitely going to be important, but to find that common stance within every group is going to be the point of where that preservation will then occur. And apparently we had all found what that common point was within all of the groups, the outdoor users, the people from the tribal communities. And that was just a plain and simple fact that at the end of the day, we were all fighting for continued access to the land. That was the common thread. The rest of the work was going to come through other discussions: preservation, conservation, ecological knowledge from the tribes, from the different sciences, from the different schools of thoughts that were out there. There is just going to be a robust conversation that needs to continually happen. And we just need to not get aggressively violent about having some hard stance positions and views. We need to come to the table with some open minds, open hearts, and less entitlement because my recreation is the only way, but rather my neighbor may do something a little different, and I need to acknowledge that. And really, it's just going to come down to some negotiations of how best do we use the land? How best do we utilize these public spaces? Because that's what it is. Public spaces. It's yours, it's mine, it's anybody's that's, you know, going to come out and visit these places.
Finding that common sense of love for land. That doesn't happen by itself. It's certainly a testament to the leadership of the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition to find that space. Thank you. I'm going to read one more question, and then I'll turn it back over to Greta to wrap us up. This question is from Eric Mulvar, who is the Executive Director of Western Watersheds Project. And he says, It's a wonderful two-part question. The genocide targeting indigenous peoples has been going on since the 1500s and continues today. How do we as a nation and as a culture dismantle the engines of genocide that are at work today? And are there ways that damage from the past genocide can be reversed? And kind of related to that is his second part of the question. As for Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante national monuments in particular, what next steps could the current administration take to maximize that restoration? So what are ways that damage from the past genocide can be reversed and the genocide that is ongoing? And what next steps can the current administration take to maximize restoration? Ralph, do you want to jump on that one first?
Well, I feel like we kind of we skipped ahead without Lyle this last time, just because we got rolling so much on this great discussion. So I'd actually like to pass the mic to him.
Excellent.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Ralph. Yeah, that's a couple big questions, hard to answer in a short time, but this thing of historical trauma is real. We talk about it a lot here at Hopi about, the repercussions of what has happened since the coming of, Westerners and Europeans to our lands. And so we try and deal with that as best we can. And one of the ways, or many ways at which we handle this or address this issue here at Hopi, and I think it's not just specific to Bears Ears, I think it's, something that can be applied to indigenous cultures, is, again, those retention of our cultural and traditional ways, which in part, is reliant upon maintaining and strengthening those connections to these landscapes. Being removed from many of our ancestral lands has had a huge detrimental impact to who we are, our own self-identity. I talk about this a lot, and this discussion here at Hopi about who we are, and who we are is tied so much and connected to these ancestral connections to various geographic regions. All the lessons and tangibles and intangibles, the spiritual aspects that are connected to those areas, are how we can, maintaining those is how we can help to overcome, some of the genocidal impacts that have occurred. It's not a, one size fits all. It's varied from tribe to tribe. And we have to, work really hard to figure out those ways individually as tribes or within our own, families and groups about how we achieve, overcoming that kind of genocidal impact. And so, those maintaining of those connections is really important to, bettering ourselves into the future, maintaining who we are in terms of our self-identity and our cultural ways. And I think that, lends itself to, the kind of the second part of the question is how can this current administration, help to impact the restoration of the boundaries and of the land itself. And I think that includes, and it has to include, a greater participation and voice of indigenous people who are not only relearning some aspects of our cultural ways within these landscapes, but are also then turning around to help not only educate the greater public, but also bringing that information back to our own communities. It's important that, we're not just looking at this from the perspective of it's all public education for those outside of our communities. We as indigenous people, really need to take a hard stance and be promoting the preservation of our culture for ourselves, as a priority. And so, those are just some ideas that I have that I've talked about in terms of, how we deal with historical trauma, the past 500 years, of negative impact. Again, it took us a long time to get to this point, to this realization of how we can begin to address these issues. And so it's not going to happen overnight, but I think that's, through continued work, through this kind of dialogue that we continue to have, we can work to have a better future for all of us. And it's, again, it takes this two-way discussion for everybody, you know, to be involved. It's something really important that the collaboration that I think, you know, is exhibited by some of the work ongoing right now. It's important for that work to continue so that, you know, everybody is at the table and talking about these issues. Sometimes they may seem outside the realm of, you know, the political and legal issues, but when you really get down to the heart of it and we start talking about who we are as humans, as Indigenous people, you know, you really start to have to look at to some of these kind of offhand, vague, abstract ideas, you know, but it's important that we, you know, have that discussion for everybody.
Thanks, Lyle. That is a lot to think about. That, I mean, what I'm kind of hearing from you is that as a leader and as a writer, you are both talking about traditional knowledge within the Hopi community, within other Indigenous communities, that there is a strength there that can reverse some of the damage of genocide, and restoring some protections to some of these areas kind of falls in line with that. It sounds like, yeah, wow. Regina, in your work, how have you found you're thinking about, I've got a cat on my lap, you're thinking about reversing the damage from genocide that is past, that is current, and what steps can the current administration take to maximize that restoration?
You know, first off, I think the powerful sense of not being so quick to whitewash history and erase the existence of people, specifically the Indigenous people. Acknowledge what happened, acknowledge the horrific trauma that we carry today. We have burdens that we carry that we don't even have any idea about, but they come with us because they are in our DNA makeup because of what our parents, our grandparents, our ancestors have endured. We have to carry those traumas. The last thing we need is for somebody to erase it and pretend like it never happened, or even worse, that because it didn't happen, that it was okay, and now you can go along your merry little way and continue to celebrate things like Columbus Day. That is not right. Acknowledge it. Acknowledge the good and bad. Do not whitewash it. You know, all those monuments that came tumbling down and that people brought down because they thought they were doing the right thing. Yes, it felt good. Yes, that was something that looked kind of like it was justifying a wrong that needed to be right. You know, yes and no. No, what are you going to do with that monument? Why was it there in the first place? Tell the story. Tell the story why it came down. That's what people need to acknowledge. Don't be quick to whitewash. Acknowledge those really bad traumas, but know that we have to create the resilience to move forward. In our tradition, one of the things is we don't look backwards. We don't acknowledge something that once has lived, but we rather let those spirits and those beings kind of rest. So sometimes when we hear, you know, and see like the monuments of the dead presidents and all of this, I remember this, one of our first trips as a group going out to Washington, D.C. And it was Eric Deschini who said, it's kind of spooky here how they keep memorializing all these dead presidents and people. And it's true. In our culture, we don't do that. We don't look backwards like that. And allowing for that to rest in a peaceful way is kind of how we dealt with that. But, you know, with the trauma and all of that, we can't, we never had a chance to heal from that. We never had a way to work through that and acquire skills to cope and become resilient. We're there now, but we're there because for so many generations, we've been stuck in survival mode. We have to gain some sense of stability within our own existence culturally and customarily. we're doing our best in this material world, in this world of entitlement. And I just strongly believe that the wrong thing to do is pretend like it didn't happen. How can we make things better with this current administration? By golly, restore some solid decision-making capacities within these groups, the planning groups, the commissions. Don't put us on as advisors. We've been advising and that hasn't worked for how many generations? Give us real hardcore existence by allowing us to be a part of that decision-making mechanism. Help us become better than we were then, and help yourselves evolve to a greater place. And how do we do that? By creating a different system that helps to justify more equality within us, that we're not just advising and telling the world, you know, the Native Americans lived in harmony with Mother Nature. Yeah, then the movie ended and it said the end. Now what?
Regina, it sounds like sovereignty and authority are what we really need to make sure that Native American leaders are able to exercise. And that's something that is not happening enough in America today. Thank you. Greta, I'll send it back to you to probably close us up. We've just had such a wonderful discussion.
Yes, I really have enjoyed this discussion. I've learned a lot, and I thank you all for sharing with me your knowledge and perspectives. I recommend the book. I recommend the forward and afterward as well. It is from our two distinguished guests here. Thank you for placing Bear's Ears in context in such a potent way for all of us, and the conversation around conservation and monument designation and how that's just a small piece of the continuum of this story that we're all part of. So thank you for that. Thank you so much to our participants. And our next book club is in August. I wish I had that handy, but we're reading Standoff by Jacqueline Keeler, which just came out. So feel free to read it, recommend it to your friends, and stay tuned for our next book club meeting. Thanks again to the panelists and everybody who participated tonight. I really appreciate it and feel grateful. Thank you.